Some of you may become somewhat uncomfortable as parts of this film unfold, but I think if you listen carefully...
Nature was intended to give you
A healthy, happy sex life is the most wonderful and terribly unpleasant. We've all experienced curiosity about ourselves and the opposite sex. Who hasn't?
Hi, I am Megan.
I'm Marcella.
And I'm Colin. And welcome to Remedial Sex Ed.
So, listeners, hi. You've read the title of this. You know what we're diving into. That's right. Yes. You've tuned into our episode on abortion.
Isn't it so much fun?
Yeah, thank you for tuning into the big heavy.
This is going to get really real. We know that this is a very controversial topic, but we really want to focus on the common ground across the political divide here. And I think we want to open with, we all want fewer abortions to happen, but we should break that down. There's the conservative argument that we want less to happen because you believe in life and conception, but then there's the liberal perspective where you want to put as few people with uteruses in the place where they have to make this decision. Right? It can be a very difficult decision, and it can leave lasting emotional and physical side effects, or it can't. But in the end, it's a hard choice, and the fewer people that have to make that hard choice would be ideal. Right?
Right.
Yeah. I think the issue here is we just disagree across party lines as to how to lower the rate. So obviously the reason we're doing what is easily the most controversial topic that our podcast could cover so early in our sweet little podcast lifespan is there may be some sort of conservative push happening by lawmakers in Alabama, Georgia, and so on to pass extremely restrictive abortion bills. And I have a feeling that this isn't the first time you're hearing this because it's been going on for a minute now.
And who knows what the current situation is going to be when this podcast episode releases.
Yeah.
We're trying to get this out as quick as possible. And I mean, we had a whole inner pod meeting about this because we know we have to talk about it. And I think as a group, we knew eventually we were going to have to talk about abortion.
Absolutely.
Yes.
This is remedial sex ed. That is a huge part of sex education, is forming an opinion on this and where you stand. I think just as a podcast, we were like, what if we did it later? And then these states were like, no, you're going to do it now.
Yeah, so we are responding to what today, but this is going to be a couple weeks in the future. So what today are new laws in Ohio, Georgia, and Alabama restricting access to abortion.
Yeah.
And so as of today, as of last Friday, the ACLU just filed a lawsuit and challenging these laws. So that's where we are right now. But we don't know what's going to happen when this comes out.
Yeah.
And I think earlier this week, according to the BBC, Donald Trump's official statement on it was that he is pro-life, but he thinks Alabama has gone too far.
Mitch McConnell also agrees with Donald Trump. So when you're seeing very high conservative leaders starting to separate themselves from these bills, I think that's really interesting and telling of just how extreme they might be.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So now seems like a very good time to openly share our bias. All three of us are pro-choice, but we have never wanted this podcast to be an echo chamber of people agreeing with us and telling us how right we are and just giving us accolades. I mean, it's great and thank you and send them my way, but no, like the whole purpose of this podcast, Megan, who had the inception, the idea, it's to create an open dialogue about sex, right?
Yeah.
Create education. Knowledge is power. And if people are more able to talk about sex, then we're more able to find the solutions to all of the negative outcomes and issues that surround sex, right?
Yeah.
So please, If you don't agree with us, if you are anti-choice, if you have other views, we want to hear them. We want you to talk to us. Please listen to this podcast, and send us an email. Send all of the social medias, like whatever. I want to have a conversation. I don't want this to be left people telling left people how right we're to be left.
And I gotta give a serious shout out to Marcella, because I think between the three of us, Colin was ready to just rip apart this argument and go deep into the control of the 1% against the man and how it's promoting class warfare and all that. I'm over here being like, this is fucking stupid, right? And blind goggles on, wanting to be like, how are we even having this debate? And Marcella's being the logical voice of reason, who's keeping this dialogue open and making sure that we are being inclusive. Because she's right. I want this to be inclusive. In my heart of hearts, I want this to be, and serious shout out to Marcella, who's actually making that possible.
You're too sweet. Look, yeah, we're just trying, It doesn't do anything if we all keep yelling.
Yeah. We are trying to, in good faith, have an open dialogue and talk about the truth.
Yeah.
Yes.
I do still think the truth is that this ultimately comes down to social control, but we'll talk about that in episode 2.
We will get there, Colin.
We are getting there.
Because I don't necessarily disagree. I will say that I probably have a little bit more of a moderate view on this topic. I'm pro-choice. I do think that I'm going to get some shade. I do think that there should be some limitations, and I know that we disagree, and I love that we have disagreements on this topic because I think it's really complicated, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I'm excited to have the conversation because I think that there's definitely stuff for me to learn. For me, being raised in Christian America made me be like, wait, whoa, hold. People think that it should be allowed always, and I didn't get that. And the more that I researched the topic, and the more that I researched the hugely politicized things around abortion, and we'll talk about this, DNX, partial birth abortions, the more I'm like, oh hey, wait a second. If you do some research and you hear the other side, there's reasoning behind all of this. There's purpose for people saying that, yes, abortion should be legal always. There's all of these other things. I'm not quite there, but I'm learning. And so I think that's why I wanted this to be a podcast about educating and being about, seeing the different sides, because I maybe have a little bit of a different view, and I've learned a lot by doing research into the other views that are out there. Diatribe over. So we expect that this is a 2-parter. It's a big thing. There's a lot to talk about. There's all of the legal precedent that's already been established. There's the objectives of the bills that are currently being pushed. Then there's all of the human aspect of it, and the fact that, let me see here. It's 77% of U.S. adults are in favor of allowing abortion for pregnancies that are the result of rape or incest. 67 are in favor of allowing the abortion if the child would be born with a life-threatening illness. And then it becomes far more controversial, and we start seeing 50% of Americans or 47% of Americans, when we start talking about allowing abortion if the child would be born mentally disabled or with Down syndrome. And then the most contentious, the 47% that I mentioned, is if the woman wants an abortion for any reason. So we want to create an open dialogue. We understand that there are different opinions on all of this. We want to hear them. We want to explore them. But yeah.
Do we want to define what abortion actually is?
Yeah. Yes, sure. Let's do
just
that
to
first.
Mansplain abortion really quick.
Yeah. Are we having Colin tell us what abortions are?
No. No.
Come on.
But yeah, maybe we should, because there's a lot of misconceptions about what abortion is, so we should probably talk about that.
So, in its very simplest definition, an abortion is when a person who has a uterus discovers that they are pregnant and they wish to terminate the pregnancy by themselves, not through natural causes such as a miscarriage, or any other possible reason why the pregnancy would terminate. For example, with an ectopic pregnancy and the doctors decide to terminate the pregnancy because you will die otherwise.
And the embryo couldn't grow.
Yeah, the embryo couldn't survive.
It's not even a pregnancy, really.
So that, in its very simplest definition, is what an abortion is.
Yeah.
There are a couple different ways that they are implemented.
Yeah, abortions, it obviously depends on the week of the pregnancy, the stage of the pregnancy. Early on, it's a pill that can be given to you in order to induce a miscarriage. And then it continues to change after that. And that's how certain precedents have been set, like the precedents around dilation and extraction. But yeah, so it depends on the stage. And disclaimer, we will talk about different procedures that happen. We will talk about partial birth, and it's graphic. Medical procedures are graphic, and so yes, be aware that will be part of the discussion today.
In its very simplest description, the NHS says that there are two methods of abortion. There's medical abortion via the pill that Marcella described, or surgical abortion, which is a minor procedure to essentially remove the pregnancy that involves anesthesia to knock the patient out. And then doctors essentially take out the fetus at whatever stage it's at, even if it's just an inseminated egg at this point, to remove that, as well as a uterine lining and any form of developmental cells that are inside.
Yeah.
That is, in its simplest definition, what happens medically. Now, there are a ton of other discussions to be had about what happens mentally to uterus havers who have to go through this procedure, whether they are completely fine with it, or whether it is a serious decision for them that they have agonized over and come to this conclusion. Probably not easily.
To be careful there, I think it's a serious decision, even if somebody walks away feeling confident in their decision. It's always a serious decision. And I think that's something that I keep hearing from the conservative perspective, is they think that there's no weight on it, or that people haven't considered what their options were. People know what their options are, and there's a lot of bills currently in place that make sure that people know what their options are if they decide to come in and have an abortion.
There are a lot of restrictions that make you wait.
Yeah.
So people who
depending on state, but
depending on the state, but people who get abortions know what they're doing, and it's no one's first choice for birth control. That's a totally ridiculous myth.
Yeah.
Anyone who ends up in that situation, I don't want to make it scary to anyone who's considering this. Look, people who work at abortion clinics, or it isn't an abortion clinic. Anyone who says abortion clinic is a little bit misinformed. It's a women's health clinic, and they happen to also do abortions occasionally. Associating Planned Parenthood with being this abortion farm is not correct. They do a lot. They give contraception to women.
Exactly. I was going to say, do you know how many abortions Planned Parenthood prevents?
Yeah.
By all of the contraceptives that they give, and all of the information that they provide, and just regular health checkups that I know women that Planned Parenthood is their primary doctor for all of their gynecological visits.
They do cancer screenings. They provide a safe space for it's so much more. So
yeah.
And I guess what I'm saying in terms of abortion, I don't want to scare people who this is their decision and they've come to this conclusion, because you know what, the professionals who work there are professional, and they're incredibly nice, and they're going to be supportive of you as you go through this. So it's not it's not a scary thing to go into. They're lovely people. What's scary about it is the social pressure that surrounds you. And I don't have any advice for that.
No, I mean, yeah, it seems like the negative effects, I mean, as we discussed later on in this episode and in the second part of the episode, getting an abortion is safer than delivering full-term pregnancy. There are fewer risks involved. Mm-hmm. So the negative effects are almost entirely social in terms of the shame and the pressure and the guilt that you feel. So I think part of my goal for this podcast is to maybe alleviate some of that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I have some statistics. They're from the CDC. So the CDC exists not to be biased. They're there to just give numbers. Huh. So these are just going to be numbers. And you can make of these numbers whatever you feel like. In 2015, the abortion rate was 11.8 per 1,000 women aged 15 to 44. The abortion rate is 188 abortions per 1,000 live births. Between 2006 and 2015, the rate of abortions dropped by 26%. Now, what I take away from that final number, and what I find really interesting, is we've had LARCs as a form of contraception for a while, the long-acting reversibles. So things that remain inside your body for 5 years and are 99% effective. They've been around for a hot second, but I remember them becoming generally greater available to the public in the early millennium. And so when I look at that number of between 2006 and 2015, that the rate of abortions dropped by a significant factor, I think there's something to be said that with more effective forms of contraception becoming more readily available to the general populace, that is one way to help alleviate the number of abortion procedures performed every year. That is my personal takeaway from that number.
Absolutely.
Especially as like IUDs have changed, because originally it was for people with uteruses after they had given birth. And so they've been made smaller. So there's been some really interesting advancement in medical technology. And I think, Megan, you're absolutely hitting it on the money with what you're saying. Like it's as we create awareness, as sex becomes less of a controversial topic to educate our children about, all of these statistics seem to lessen.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the CDC also had to say that women in their 20s account for the majority of abortions. They account for half. The CDC is one of my sources on this. My other source is the Guttmacher Institute, which we also reference later in this pod. They do a ton of research on abortion. So more than half are aged in their 20s, and 12% are those who are adolescents. So essentially the so 18 to 19 is 8%, 15 to 17 are 3%, and those younger than 15 are 0.2%.
Wow. I'm glad to hear it's 0.2.
Right?
Yeah.
And 91% of abortions take place at 13 weeks or less.
Yes.
So within that first trimester.
Thank you. Yes, I definitely wanted to hit on that statistic because, 91% are happening at what everyone, not controversial at all, can say is below fetal viability.
Yes.
Like there is no pregnancy at this point that will survive outside of a uterus, out of a womb.
Mm-hmm. And then I just have one other number to share, and the only reason I want to share it is for personal reasons. According to Guttmacher, if I'm saying that even right, I'm sorry. Half of pregnancies are unintended, which I love that because I was a mistake child, and I think that's awesome. So those are my numbers.
Yeah.
I'm done.
I have a quick number that I think is important. This is again from Guttmacher Institute, who does a lot of research into abortion in the U.S. It says that around 25% of U.S. women will have an abortion by age of 45. So that's 1 in 4. And so it's really important to know that this is a common thing. And I think it's really important to kind of blow the lid on that, in the same way that we were doing with miscarriages. That miscarriages are so common, and that more people need to talk about it and know that they're not alone, and that this isn't like some out there thing that only that only the people on the very fringes do. Also, 59% of people who get abortions already have children, so they're mothers. I really just want to try to get rid of the stigma that surrounds people who get abortions and tries to stigmatize them as like irresponsible or like young partiers or that sort of thing. And I know we talk about this a little bit later, but
I think it's something to hammer home is you probably have friends that have had an abortion and who are just not open or willing to tell you. And it's a very personal decision, but it's not as far removed from you as you think it is.
Yeah. Very much so.
Mm-hmm.
Colin.
Yes.
You mentioned when we were in a production meeting for this guy
Uh-huh.
that people usually associate the anti-choice / pro-life argument
Mm-hmm.
with a religious argument.
Mm-hmm.
And you info-bombed this fact that that's actually a fairly recent development, which neither Marcella and I actually knew.
Yes. Let's look at some facts. Yeah. So for Catholics in America, at least, actually worldwide, abortion and being anti-choice was specifically a Catholic issue for a long time. It didn't gain traction in the Protestant mainstream or in evangelical Protestantism until after Roe v. Wade in the 70s. And when Roe v. Wade was first decided, most Protestant denominations either had nothing to say, and a few of them were very much in favor of the decision. So this is not like a long-held Christian belief. This is a recent development that really comes hand in hand with the rise of a certain element within the conservative right wing and the rise of the religious right. Let me just read you some quotes. So I have here an excerpt from an article in a Christian magazine called Touchstone Magazine. And this is a pretty conservative publication, and it's just giving the history of the evangelical movement in terms of the pro-life position. And it's really talking about anti-abortion and anti-contraception. I guess I'll just begin. When, in 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court and its Roe and Doe decisions overturned the anti-abortion laws of all 50 states, relatively few Protestants voiced opposition. Indeed, some mainline denominations had already endorsed liberalized abortion. The prominent Southern Baptist pastor, W.A. Criswell, openly welcomed the decision. Representing a position many evangelicals then took, he claimed, "I have always felt that it was only after the child was born and had life separate from its mother that it became an individual person." Others drew the line at some point before birth, but few rejected the decisions outright. The Southern Baptist Convention itself had, in 1971, urged its members to work for legislation that will allow the possibility of abortion under such conditions as rape, incest, clear evidence of severe fetal deformity, and carefully ascertained evidence of the likelihood of damage to the emotional, mental, and physical health of the mother. So, like I said, this has not always been a Christian position, and there was once a time when it was allowed for people, even of fairly conservative evangelical strains of Christianity, to have a variance of beliefs on this topic. It wasn't always that life began at conception, so I'd like you to examine your beliefs and just say, when did this take place and why has it taken place? There's an author by the name of Randall Balmer, who wrote a book called Thy Kingdom Come, which is a sort of a history of abortion rights and the evangelical movement. And he says that the abortion myth that this is all about protecting children, or that the fetus is a person, and the myth that the fetus has the same rights as a human child. The abortion myth serves as a convenient fiction because it suggests noble and altruistic motives behind the formation of the religious right. But it is highly disingenuous and renders absurd the argument of the leaders of a religious right that in defending the rights of the unborn, they are new abolitionists. The religious right arose as a political movement for the purpose, effectively, of defending racial discriminations at Bob Jones University and other segregated schools. So what it comes down to is that abortion was not an evangelical position until the Supreme Court started ruling against segregation. the abortion position is an after effect of these religious schools not liking the Supreme Court telling them what to do when it came to desegregating private Christian schools. And so they latched on to abortion rights to ally themselves with the conservative right wing of U.S. politics as sort of an afterthought and as this sort of totem that they could use to make themselves appear as if they were these righteous protectors of children's rights. But really, the rise of the religious right has a much darker genesis. And it's really about them not liking the Supreme Court telling them what to do when it came to desegregating religious schools. So,
Nice.
yeah. So, if you're a conservative religious person and you genuinely believe that life begins at conception, then I can definitely see where you're coming from if that's your belief, being anti-abortion or anti-choice. If you believe that children are being killed. But I just want you to know that Christians have not always held this belief. This is a very recent development, and it was a cynical move on the part of a coalition of evangelical leaders and conservative Republicans to sort of put this together.
Wow.
So, yeah, just think, is this really something you believe, or or have you been duped?
It's just, it was really surprising to me to hear that when you told us about it in the production meeting, and I immediately started doing some research, and it was just crazy to me that this isn't a staple of American debate. This is new. This is fresh. Yeah, that's insane to me.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it weird that we live in a time where things evolve so quickly that something that was proposed in the 60s and 70s has officially become a foundational staple for life in America?
All of history has been erased, and this is what's true now.
It began with the dawn of the baby boomers.
Yeah.
So yeah, plenty of Christians throughout history have supported abortion rights and contraception, and they didn't find anything wrong with it. And still to this day. And then, and then something happened.
I think it's time to talk about what the dun-dun-dun moment was. Let's talk about the history.
So today we have a guest star who I've been friends with for several moons. All the moons.
Many moons.
It's my dear friend, Alix Young.
It me.
Hi, Alex.
Woohoo! Hi, Alex.
Thanks for coming on.
So do you want to give a quick little intro to yourself, Miss Alix?
I am Miss Alix. I'm a attorney.
Woo!
That's what qualifies me. That it. I don't know what you're looking for. Are you looking for my sexual history or?
I'll always take your sexual history.
We always have time for that.
Yeah.
I'm a lawyer, which is the big thing when you're talking about abortion laws. And I did study abortion as the capstone for my law degree. So basically my dissertation was on TRAP laws, which is targeted regulations of abortion providers, and how it affects marginalized peoples in particular.
Mm-hmm.
So I have researched this a little bit.
Very cool.
But I don't actually do this as a job, because basically the ACLU does this as a job and that it. But yeah, that's me.
You're definitely far more qualified than the three of us non-lawyers who
Yes.
only have Google to help us on this journey.
Yes.
I know how to read a court opinion, which is what law school teaches you.
Skills.
Also, as a side note, doesn't necessarily qualify you for this conversation, but does qualify you to be here. You have your own podcast.
It does.
Yeah, tell us about it.
So, completely unrelated to anything. Actually, no, I talk about law a lot. But
yeah, you do.
Yeah, because it's related. I have a podcast called Pomegranates and Pitchforks. It is a horror and true crime podcast, and
it's hella good, listeners.
It's
so good.
Best of
Alex isn't gonna toot her own horn, but it's really good.
Thank
It's
you.
super well informed, and I guess Alex doesn't talk about law all that much, but her lawyery definitely comes through in like the thoroughness of the research she does on every case.
Awesome.
And she makes it really interesting. And her co-host Sunny is also great, and they're both hilarious together, and they both have great things to say.
Aw.
And so I really enjoy listening. It's one of the few like I listen to a lot of podcasts, just like way too many, and some of them are like approaching the 2-hour mark, but this is the only one that will do like an hour and a half, hour 45 podcast that I have to listen to straight, because it's just that interesting. Yeah, it's really they always tell a really good story, so go check them out.
I listen to you constantly at work because like I have to AutoCAD frequently, which is just me sitting at a desk for hours on end.
Mm-hmm.
So it really helps me get through that.
Oh, thank you.
It's the only podcast Megan listens to.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate.
So it's really cool to have a guest star on.
And I guess as a note that is kind of related to what we talk about on this podcast, it is a heavy listen, but Pomegranates and Pitchforks did a very thorough history of the sex offenders list.
Sex offender registry.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and that was very legal. We talked about court precedent and stranger danger.
Love it. In it. Want to check it out.
That was some big heavy, though. That's like some you need ice cream and puppies between each episode, because...
Yes. So now that we have our expert aboard, she is an expert. We wanted to talk about how we got here, the cases that have created the precedent that's currently being challenged, and maybe just like some general discussion as to why we think these things were put in for a reason and how there's purpose maybe behind decisions that have already happened. Do you want to take?
I mean, I can definitely talk about this.
Let's take us through.
This is actually totally the kind of thing that we would discuss on my podcast, because this actually has like a lot of weird history in it. If you read Roe, they talk about it a lot, the actual legislative history, because we didn't really have any precedent before, the late 1900s of abortion cases. And so that's kind of a problem when you're looking at like stare decisis and Supreme Court decisions, and they like precedent. That's their thing.
Yeah.
And so they go into like, what did the Greeks do? And where did the Hippocratic Oath come from? Like in Roe, and talking about Old English common law, which is where we get most of our common law. And, like abortion restrictions weren't really a thing until the like 1850s plus in America. They had some here and there, but it wasn't really considered like a felony, like a big deal thing. And then it was always the quickening, which is when you start feeling the baby move, which was their kind of like viability
standard
differentiation. And the history of everything ever, you get some discussion of abortion restrictions here and there, but it's never quite as divisive as it is now, where you actually think like, oh, this is murder. It was always either totally okay before the quickening, or at the worst it was like not great.
Right.
Misdemeanor level, not okay.
In what research I've done, because the angle I've been coming at is like the history of the evangelical movement the history of so what I've been looking into is the history of the evangelical movement in America, conservative Christianity, and their relationship to abortion. And like the idea that abortion is murder doesn't really come up until the 70s, until
post
just before and after Roe.
Yeah.
So it's a very recent development.
It is very recent. It's very, very recent that we started thinking of pregnancies as personhood.
I think that's an important distinction to make, because abortion has existed for, I think it's safe to say, for as long as people have been getting pregnant. Like we've been
at least attempting to control our reproductive health. Yeah.
Yeah. For a long time, I guess you wouldn't call it an abortion. You'd probably call it people trying to induce a miscarriage. But it certainly happens, and like in medieval times, there's a lot of records of using certain herbs, making concoctions that would induce a miscarriage, and then,
Alligator poop in
Yeah.
Egypt.
There's all sorts of stuff.
Didn't work, by the way. Don't use it to any kind of reproductive health. Just don't.
Poop gets used a lot.
But yeah, no, on that note of the history of abortion, I think that basically as medicine has advanced, so have women's rights. And you can't separate those two things. And you can't separate that from the legal discussion. And so basically we have developed more and more methods of controlling our reproductive health, which has made it so that, we can have divorces, we can enter the workforce, we can control our own lives. And that has enabled the feminist movement and the equality movement and just the ability to live equally in a system together. And I don't think controlling women can be taken out of this discussion because, that's even discussed in Roe, is one of the state interests in abortion is controlling women's sexuality. And, they dismiss it outright, but they do talk about how that's an actual issue. And then, in the 50s, there was this really, really infamous case of Jacqueline Smith. I'm not sure if you guys stumbled upon that one.
Don't think so.
It's basically an infamous murder, manslaughter. It's basically your coat hanger abortions that we're all, that we all talk about, but we don't really have like a good example of because those are horrible horror stories. But this woman, she was 20. She was, going into fashion design. She was doing great stuff. She was also white, so we care about her more. I'm not political. You're political.
Fortunately.
And she had kind of a lover who, when she found out she was pregnant, didn't want to marry her. So she was like, well, fuck this. This is the 50s. I'm not dealing with the repercussions of being a pregnant single woman.
Yeah.
Because, you had to like go off to some random nunnery where they would pretend you were sick for 9 months and then you come back and everybody knew what happened and you just had to deal with your scarlet letter. And so he set up with basically a buddy who was a med tech at a local hospital who stole some medicine and devices, and they put her legs up in stirrups with brooms, and it was exactly the like horror story that you think of when you think of like coat hanger abortions, and this is why we have legal safe abortions. And she died of, I think that they over anesthetized her.
Ooh.
I haven't read this story in a while, so
bearing with you,
grain of salt. But if I remember all of the facts right, she died of basically your classic back alley abortion, and then they didn't want people to know, and so they dismembered her body and left her around the city in trash cans.
Ooh.
And that basically became a big part of the abortion discussion was, hey, if we make this illegal, women are gonna die. And that was all the way back in the 50s.
Wow.
But then abortion restrictions kept getting stricter, except for in places like New York, where Jacqueline Smith was. And that's kind of your precedent for...
So, Alex, I have a question for you. You mentioned that kind of how the law evolves is the same way that medical technology evolves of what is safe for another human being.
Mhm.
Do you know when we start seeing safe ways to perform abortion medically?
I mean, some level of safe medical abortion has been around since like the dawn of man. Basically, chemically induced abortions and like the herbs and the yada yada has been safer than just going through with the pregnancy. Later term abortions, that comes with medicine, where you actually have to cure it and dilate and extract and that stuff.
Great. So we're talking, so late term.
Late term.
Yeah, exactly.
Anything that
it's such a
requires
controversial
like an actual...
term. Doctors don't actually use this term. They hate it because it creates so much stigma, and people believe that late term means that you have a fully formed fetus and you're talking like 38 weeks. Later term really just means anything past 20 weeks. And because fetal viability is 23, 24, you're not really seeing anything after that unless it's like a medical issue. So just to chime in, we're talking about like post 20 weeks, which currently less than 1% of abortions happen after 20 weeks.
Right. Well, and even just anything that requires like an actual medical intervention that's beyond chemical medicine.
Pill,
Yeah. Anything that requires like going in to the uterus that comes with medical. Basically, there are two main points. There's, we discovered washing our hands. So that was a big deal. And then when we discovered antibiotics, and that's around when I guess more surgical. It's still not a surgery, but like more actual like body getting in there procedures.
Yeah, D&E, DNX.
That's when those abortion procedures start getting a lot safer for folks.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Great.
Although you guys probably want like an actual discussion of the case precedent, huh?
Yeah. Let's do that.
I've just sort of been giving you my horror history side of things.
No, it's good. I'm into it.
Yeah,
it's
all for horror history.
Which is a lot more palm pitch pod and a lot less lawyer.
No, I'm in. Okay, so let's establish. I mean, we really don't have to go through all of them. There are so many, but maybe we'll hit like the big ones.
There's a couple of like big major ones. Yeah. So obviously, you start with like the marriage cases, which happened in the 60s. You get the big one was Griswold v. Connecticut, which was a right to contraception case for married couples, and that's where your right to privacy comes up within the marriage, and it kind of becomes like a reproductive health right to privacy and a woman's right to control her reproductive health right to privacy, and then you get like Loving v. Virginia and all of those other cases that talk about the sanctity of marriage and how that's important in a fundamental constitutional right kind of thing, but it becomes a right to privacy, and that's where Roe was decided on. And Roe, not quite 10 years later, is the right to privacy case that gives us a constitutional right to abortion, where essentially the holding from Griswold pulls over to Roe, where a decision that is such a medical and personal decision is not the kind of thing that the court should be getting involved in. And so they outlined this strict, and I mean, I've been talking about all of the blah, 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 quickening and that sort of stuff. And so they outlined this strict 3-trimester, basically first trimester, they establish it is literally safer to have an abortion than to go through with childbirth. Therefore, the states are not allowed to interfere at all. And then post-viability, the states can interfere as much as they want, except for in, life of the woman, because there's the potential for life there. And so it's kind of set up in the 3 trimesters, but
right.
It gets complicated because of the medical technology increasing.
Yes.
And the law not being fast enough to keep up with it.
Yeah.
And then basically they say, so first trimester, no regulation. Third trimester, very, very regulation. And then the second trimester, states have an interest in preserving life. So whatever they want to do, they can do it.
Yes. Something that I found really interesting about Roe v. Wade is that it was decided by conservative judges. So everyone is very afraid, and we'll get into this later, about like the current state of the Supreme Court and that kind of stuff. But the judges were a majority Republican judges nominated by Republican presidents. A majority,
It was a majority decision, yeah.
Yeah, it was a majority decision, and it was, like you were saying, this wasn't that controversial back then. This
it was
seemed
actually very controversial.
well. Okay, yes,
It was a very strange case.
yes,
Because only about a third of the nation had legalized abortion.
right.
And so it was an interesting case. Sometimes the Supreme Court is very, very behind in the move of the times, and people are like, come on, give us this thing. And the Supreme Court's like, and sometimes the Supreme Court is very, very ahead of things. And this is one of those cases where the Supreme Court was ahead of things. But you kind of have to look at, we're just coming out of the 60s. We're getting into like the feminist movement, the equal rights movement. We're getting into a lot of civil rights movements, actually. So I think that's where you have to look at the court from, is there was all of that going on.
Yeah.
Because as much as the Supreme Court shouldn't be partisan and shouldn't be inspired by politics, like, they're all human beings. They're very much inspired by politics.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I mean, I think the point you were trying to make is like, I know talking to my grandfather about the history of the decision about abortion. I mean, the decision for abortion is essentially what solidified several states as Republican, and actually what switched a lot of states from Democrat to Republican. Mm-hmm. And I think it is interesting that it is commonly associated with a Democratic issue, given that the Supreme Court was a majority Republican. But I would also argue that those Republican Party of the 70s is a totally different party than what it is now.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, you definitely get a different political sphere in what Republican and Democrat means, depending on where you're putting your marker in the history of the U.S.
Definitely.
For sure. And also just in my amateur lawyery,
Go for it. I can't wait.
I just, when we say that the Roe Court was conservative, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were like politically conservative, although they probably were. They could just be constitutionally conservative. Right. And so sometimes when you talk about the history of the court and Supreme Court decisions, when you hear of a conservative judge, it's not usually referring to like where they stand on the political spectrum. It might refer to how they interpret the Constitution as conservative, more to the letter, or liberal, interpreting it according to the spirit.
Right.
Yeah. And then basically the next big case is Casey v. Planned Parenthood, where the court actually technically overturned Roe in part. They didn't take away the right to abortion. That stayed, obviously. But they rejected the 3-trimester standard and replaced it with an undue burden standard, which is what we're looking at now, like from that point on.
Can you define the difference?
So the difference is basically that courts regulating or interpreting the constitutionality of abortion laws becomes a lot more complicated.
Okay. Because
it becomes, is this an undue burden? And that is so goddamn subjective.
Yeah.
Which is a problem. That was one of the dissents in Planned Parenthood v. Casey, was this is so goddamn subjective.
Yeah.
And I mean, basically with Planned Parenthood v. Casey, both pro-choicers and anti-choicers thought of it as a win, because it was, kind of, for both of them.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Because we simultaneously kept abortion rights. Like, we still have a right to abortion.
Right. People thought it was going to be overturned.
Yeah.
Like,
well, and there's been an abortion case every fucking year since Roe.
Yeah.
And so every fucking year we're like, oh, it's going to be overturned. And I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, we'll get there.
But yeah, so we kept our right to abortion, but we did kind of limit it. Basically, we're now allowed to regulate a ton more with the Casey with the Casey ruling. So
gotcha.
And the fetal viability changed to much earlier. Not much earlier, but like medical standard now says like 23, 24 weeks during this case, whereas before it was like a trimester based thing. And they did try to base it more on like medically when can the fetus live outside of the mother versus third trimester sounds good, you know?
And that, I mean, so the viability had been like the important part in both cases. It's just that, again, we have... This is, again, where, like, the medical field advancing while the law is advancing makes things way more complicated because simultaneously we are able to keep a fetus alive earlier than we were before. But also, we are making abortion safer at later stages than we were before. And so we get this weird gray area in the middle where everybody's really mad.
Yes, which totally becomes it's hugely apparent when we start talking about like DNX and what is the other term for it? What's the like
dilation and extraction?
Yes, but no, what's the really controversial name for that type of abortion? Partial birth abortion.
Partial birth abortion.
Yes,
I am
DNX
I hate those. Abortions. I hate that case. I hate everything.
Yeah,
I hate everything.
Yes,
that would make me so angry.
Yeah.
I don't even
Big mood.
Which abortion case it was, but I read it and I was mad.
Yeah, it's hard because it's the horrors of it, like the way that it was. It's all how you publicize stuff.
Yeah.
Because
and like even if you think about it from a medical perspective, basically somebody was saying like, oh, they're pulling out the baby entirely, and they gave this whole like, this is where the rhetoric of oh, you're aborting live fetuses comes from.
Yeah.
Is this completely ignorant idea of, oh, you're pulling out a whole baby. So obviously you have these crying fetuses in the trash can of abortion clinics, which is so false.
So not real.
But it's so much safer.
Exactly.
So much safer.
Exactly.
Basically, you have a later term abortion. You don't have these for fun. This isn't, oh, I just decided because I wasn't feeling it today. This is like, I wanted this pregnancy and something is going tremendously wrong. And so we need to take this thing out. And so you dilate and you extract.
Yeah.
The way you birth a child, but, earlier because you need to get rid of it now.
Yeah.
Whereas the alternative that we're left with now that D&E has been banned is...
DNX has been banned.
Or
Yes. DNX.
No, it's dilation and extraction. D&E. Where now the alternative is you cut up the fetus inside the womb and pull it out bit by bit, which increases your chance of perforating the uterus. It increases your chance of leaving bits of baby in there. Like, it is so intensely disgusting that somehow removing a full fetus is more gross to the population than cutting it up while it's still inside and pulling it out bit by bit.
That's horrifying.
Those are the difference.
That sounds so much worse.
It's very worse. That case sucked and I hated it.
Ugh.
Is it both D&E and DNX?
They're different. And this is the thing. Describing how abortion works, it's gruesome. It's no matter how you do it, it's gruesome.
But it's a medical procedure.
Dilation and evacuation is D&E and is what you described.
Yeah.
DNX, which is partial birth abortions, is a little bit different. And again, this is gruesome. But it's where you partially birth the child, but you end up basically crushing the skull.
Yeah.
And then delivering it that way. And again, it was a medical advancement for the safety of the woman.
Okay.
Because it's again, if you do abortion where you're cutting the fetus in the body, you create all of these other issues where you can cut so many different things inside of the body, and it's so much more dangerous. It sounds really brutal hearing the idea of like a fetus coming out of the body. I understand that's how they marketed it.
Yeah.
And that's why it became so controversial. But yeah, I mean, there's no other than very early when you're talking about an embryo that you're taking a pill, that's a lot less gruesome for us to talk about. But yeah, later term abortions, it's going to be gruesome and hard no matter how you do it.
But it's a medical procedure.
Exactly.
Everything is gruesome.
Yes.
I had a surgery on my leg last year. They cut open my leg and pushed the bone splinters together and drilled it back together. Could you imagine how disgusting that is?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a medical procedure.
It's a medical procedure.
It's gruesome.
Yeah. Yes.
But yeah, no, you're right. The dilation and extraction and the dilation and evacuation have
different.
I got the acronyms mixed up.
They're so close.
But yeah, the dilation and extraction is the one where you pull out a whole fetus. It's a lot safer for the pregnant person. And the alternative, which is what we're left with, is the one where you pull it out bit by bit, which is so much more unsafe.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Hi,
Okay.
politics.
Hi.
Yeah, it's real gross. It's real big yuck. Everybody get angry. It's fine.
Yes.
But like you said, any medical procedure is going to be
Gruesome.
gross.
Yeah.
Like when my mom got her hip replaced, and they had to hammer the new joint into her.
Yeah.
I'm twitching.
Yeah. No, it's
We can talk about how gross pregnancy is even by itself.
Yeah.
Birth in itself is gruesome.
birth
Yes.
is gruesome.
Yes.
Yeah.
Horrifying.
Imagine describing birth
No.
to anybody.
Do we have any more history that we want to discuss?
The other thing about the difference between Roe and Casey is that Roe was decided on privacy rights, and Casey was decided on equal rights.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So Roe was a lot more 9th Amendment, whereas Casey was a lot more 14th Amendment,
Right.
which is a lot more established as a fundamental right in the Constitution. So essentially, women deserve the right to control their own reproductive health care, and the reliance on Roe has enabled it to, so that women can exist in society
Sure.
as equal
Bodily
or
autonomy.
players.
Yeah.
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 But the legal distinction is important, because
Yeah.
a lot of people think, oh, we're overturning Roe. No, we're actually fighting Casey.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I've heard the criticism that Roe isn't the best legal standing for protecting abortion rights because it is based on the 9th Amendment.
Mm-hmm. Which is the
Is that okay?
amendment.
Okay.
It's we threw some rights in here that we might not actually have included in here, but they are definitely rights. So those are protected too. Amendment.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Then
that's the 9th Amendment. Is like
the 9th
there are
is
other
the one where they're like all the rights that you think
should be in here.
you think
are
should be
definitely
in here
Yeah.
are in here.
That's the 9th Amendment, which is why it's like very debatable.
Yeah.
Whereas the 14th Amendment is like, if you are born in the United States, you have equal rights under the law. Actually, no, it's if you're a person in the United States, you have equal rights under the law. And so, sex, race, creed, religion, all that stuff, all of those
Cool.
protected classes. And so
Okay.
that's where Casey was decided, was women need the right to control their reproductive health care so that they can have anything that resembles a chance at equality in the U.S.
Okay.
There's
Yeah,
a few
Casey
cases
is like the
since Casey
majority.
that, they continue to kind of, this is not undue burden, this is undue burden. Like Hellerstedt, which was decided in 2016, which was actually a big surprise for me because 2016 is when I graduated, so that's when I was writing my dissertation. And Hellerstedt was actually some of the cases that I was using as examples. That was the Texas case with all of the weird trap laws that basically made it so that there were almost no abortion clinics left in Texas. And Texas is a big place.
Very large.
But yeah, Hellerstedt was actually, they decided that the random trap laws that were discussed in Hellerstedt were undue burdens, which was pretty nuts.
Yeah.
So they win for us.
Yeah.
Did not expect.
Thank you for the overview on where we are today, how legal precedent was set, and some of the major cases that are basically being challenged right now.
Yeah.
Today in the U.S., 75% of adults, according to a Gallup poll, and we'll link a lot of our information so that you can see where we did all research this. We invited a lawyer on purpose. We're really trying to get to the heart of the issue, and we care about why these decisions were made. we don't think that these decisions were made carelessly, and we wanted to be sure to research and provide information that is reliable. So 75% of adult Americans think that Roe v. Wade should not be overturned. And then to break that down even more, 29% of all legal adults think that all abortions should be legal. 50% of all adults believe that abortion should be legal under certain circumstances. And that definitely varies, right? As to what those circumstances may be. But I think that's where we get the majority of people saying, hey, there's a reason that Roe v. Wade exists. And we can all agree on that. And then it's only 18% of the adult population in the US that believes that all abortions should be illegal. It's a huge minority. But yeah, I think there is a lot of commonality across the table when you take out a lot of political language that's just meant to fire people up and upset you. So I think our goal is to try and find what that commonality is. Yeah, I don't know.
No, it's good. And I think just to tack onto that a little bit, it's that we want our listeners to listen to this discussion in good faith and take an honest, sort of dispassionate look at not only opinion polls, but the facts.
Like we said, this is going to be a two-parter. Thank you so much for listening all the way through this episode. We invite you to come back next week when we release our next episode. And yeah, let's get the conversation started. I'm sure that we've said some stuff that you maybe disagree with, or maybe you agree with. Let us know.
Also, as a heads up, like as we mentioned, this is going to be a two-parter episode. So very recently, we moved to the every other week upload. Mm-hmm. And for this, we're going to ignore that.
We're going to do it sequentially. Yes. Yeah, we're going to do it 2 weeks in a row. We're going to break every rule. That makes sense. Yeah, we are going to not have a pattern ever again. It's fine.
I'm Megan.
I'm Marcella.
And I'm Colin.
Thanks for listening, friends.
Thanks for Big Heavy.
You will agree that the concept will contribute to the rearing of a mature person.
An absence of...
Oh, yeah, you don't have to be thinking about sex.